Okay, so this is a continuation of my previous lecture on energy flow. Now we will be talking about food webs and ecological pyramids. So the learning objectives for food webs, you need to be able to define the terms autotroph and heterotroph. You need to be able to explain the trophic categories in a food web. And then if I give you the picture of a food web, you need to be able to identify the trophic categories and the flow of energy. So let's talk about autotrophs and heterotrophs. I mentioned it in my previous lecture, but I'm going to go into a little bit more depth here. So organisms that conduct photosynthesis or produce their own food are called autotrophs. Remember that auto means kind of like the self, right? So an autotroph makes food for itself, right? We cannot do that. Humans cannot do that. We need to eat, but plants can make their own food. Now, a heterotroph is an organism that eats other organisms. Okay, so let's look at the picture here. Now, an autotroph, we also call those producers, right? They're producing the food for the ecosystem. So here we have the sun, we have grass, photosynthesis, and that means that the plant is taking in water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight, and producing sugar and oxygen. Now, if you look below that, this shows you plants, some bacteria, algae, just to remind you that it's not only plants that photosynthesize. Now, a heterotroph, that's like everything else, right? Heterotrophs are all the organisms that cannot conduct photosynthesis. So it shows a grasshopper and a toad, humans, animals, most bacteria, fungi, all of these organisms need to consume other organisms. That is why we are called heterotrophs. Troph means like eat. Now, heterotrophs are also called consumers. And you're probably familiar with these terms, producer, consumer, because you may have learned about food chains in whatever courses you've taken before. So let's move on. So the next step is to learn about food webs. Now I put a food chain here, food chain of an owl, right? And you're probably used to seeing ecosystems demonstrated in that way. But if you think about it, the food chain of an owl is not showing you an ecosystem. It is just showing you what owls eat, right? So food chain, as I wrote here, is a path that energy and nutrients take as they move through an ecosystem. And what I mean by that is a herbivore eats plants to get energy. So the energy is going from plant to the organism that ate the plant, and then it travels to the next organism that eats the previous organism, right? So you're looking at energy flow through the food chain. But now a food web, and this is how we think of ecosystems now, shows all of these interconnected or dependent food chains and how they overlap in an entire ecosystem. Now, remember, an ecosystem is something like the Sonoran Desert, right? It's a desert ecosystem. You can have an ecosystem in a pine forest, an ecosystem in a coral reef. Okay, so ecosystem refers to all of the living organisms in a given area, plus factors like rainfall, temperature, humidity, right? All of these things are considered when we look at an ecosystem. Now, let's take a look at this food web. Notice that it is more complex than the food chain and that there's arrows kind of going all over the place. So the arrows, let's look at the butterfly here on the bottom. The arrows show you the flow of energy from prey to predator. So this butterfly has an arrow going from itself up to a frog. That's showing you that when the frog eats the butterfly, that energy goes from the butterfly to the frog. So your arrow should mostly be pointing upward in a food web. So now I would like you to take a second and do this, or you can do it later after you're done watching the video. I'm trying to get my box out of the way here. Okay, so I gave you some terms and I want you to match them to their definition. And then I said, try to apply the terms to the food web on the right. Okay, so I wrote down producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. So basically, first level, second level, third level of consumers. Now, below I wrote definitions. Produces food in the form of sugar. Take a second and think about that. So that would be the producers, right? The organisms that conduct photosynthesis. By the way, any organism that conducts photosynthesis is green. Okay, so when you look at plants, obviously they're all green, well, mostly, they conduct photosynthesis. Okay, my second definition is consumes other organisms, but is rarely preyed on by other predators. So let me tell you what I mean by that. And move this little box again. So if you look up at the top here, hawks and owls, snakes, foxes, they're all at the top, right? Not many organisms prey on a hawk or an owl, for instance. So I would call those tertiary predators. We also call them apex. Oh, I wrote consumer here. Tertiary or apex consumer. Those are predators, and they're at the very top of the food web, right? Consumes, number three, consumes other animals, but it is also preyed on by predators. So that would be our secondary consumer, right? So here we have, let's take a look at our food web here, like a toad, for instance. Okay, it's on the far right. A toad eats insects, predaceous insects, but it is eaten by snakes. So it eats organisms, but other organisms eat it as well. So that would be like our carnivores or omnivores in the middle of the web. Now, hopefully you've heard of these terms: carnivore, omnivore, herbivore. So carnivore exclusively eats other animals, or other animals. And omnivore eats plants and animals. Humans are omnivores for the most part. Herbivores eat vegetation. Okay, so we know where the producers produce food in the form of sugar, and they do that by taking in sunlight. We have a secondary consumer. It eats other animals, but there are things that eat it as well. We have the tertiary consumer. Those are the predators at the very top of the food web. Things don't really eat tertiary predators very much. And then finally, my last definition, number 4, consumes plants and animals. That would be an omnivore, and that would be a primary consumer. Okay, now primary consumers are also organisms that just eat plants, but they can eat plants and animals. So let's look at our food web here. We have rabbits, squirrels, mice, seed-eating birds. These are all primary consumers. They mostly eat plants. Okay, now I've put here on the bottom which category forms the base of all food webs. That would be a producer. I'm going to write a definition here, a couple definitions. So I talked about herbivores, omnivores, carnivores. I'm going to write down the definitions for you. Actually, instead of eat plants, I'm going to write eat. Herbivores eat vegetation. We have omnivores. And finally, carnivores. Okay, so for this, you need to know the terms that I have underlined and the terms that I just wrote here, because you need to know these in order to understand food webs. Okay. So the last part of this PowerPoint is ecological pyramids. And this is kind of putting together all of the information that we have learned. So just for a quick review, the first part of the PowerPoint, I'm going to write a few things down here for you. The first part of the PowerPoint looked at energy flow, right? So I'm going to write here products of photosynthesis are the input for respiration. Okay, and it goes the other way as well, right? Then you learned about food webs. So food webs show the interconnectedness and overlap between food chains in an ecosystem. Now remember, you need to know all the terms that go along with food webs. So now we are moving on to ecological pyramids. So you need to know, or you need to be able to describe or explain the 10% rule. And you also need to be able to explain the difference between an energy pyramid and a biomass pyramid. So let's move on. Okay, so an energy pyramid is what I'm showing you at the right, on the right here. So this shows the flow of energy through an ecosystem. So basically, we are taking a food web and displaying it as a pyramid. Okay, and I'll explain to you why it's a pyramid. Now, when I talk about energy flow, right, you eat food, and that is turned into energy in your body, okay? Now, as we go from trophic level to trophic level, meaning producers to primary consumers, secondary and tertiary, energy flows up the trophic levels, okay? So let's take a look at the picture here. It says producers, 10,000 kilocalories. Kilocalorie is just a way of measuring energy. Okay, now your producers are also your autotrophs, and they conduct photosynthesis. Now, if we have 10,000 kilocalories of energy, which is what the plants are producing from sunlight, and we go up to the next level, primary consumers, only 1,000 kilocalories are available to primary consumers. So the producers make 10,000 kilocalories, but only 1,000 of that is carried to the next level. And then if you look at secondary consumers, it's only 100 kilocalories. And finally, tertiary consumers only receive 10 kilocalories. So this is what we call the 10% energy rule. Only 10% of the energy in the previous trophic level is available for the next trophic level. So let me say that again. Only 10% of the energy available in a trophic level is passed on to the next one. That's why there are, like, the number of producers or the mass of producers is so much greater than, say, tertiary consumers. You need so many plants, a ton of plants, to support one eagle. And that is because energy is lost at every stage, every trophic level, you lose energy. So now let's take a look at what that is. Where does the energy go? So again, the J stands for joules. It's just another way to measure energy. You don't need to know those abbreviations. But what I do want you to see here is we have 1,000,000 joules of sunlight. 10% is available to, oh, that's sunlight, I'm sorry. Let's start up at producers. 10,000 joules of energy from the producers. Only 1,000 or 10% is available to primary consumers. Only 10% of that, or 100 joules, is available to secondary, and only 10 joules is available to tertiary consumers. That's why it looks like a pyramid. You have a really wide base of producers, and they only support a certain number of primary consumers. Those support fewer secondary, and then tiny little bit of tertiary. Okay, now the energy is lost as heat. Anytime energy goes from one object or living organism to another, most of it is lost as heat. Think about it this way. Let's say you eat, I don't know, pasta, right? Lots of carbs, lots of fuel for cell respiration. And then you go work out. So you're taking in food that's like chemical energy, right? It's all these molecules that make up pasta. Is going into your body's making cell energy, and then you're working out. So you're taking that cellular energy and you're turning it into movement. Well, when you work out, you get really hot, right? Sometimes you can even feel the heat coming off your skin. That is because heat is lost when energy goes from energy in your cell to the energy of movement. Anytime energy is transferred from one thing to another, heat is given off. Most of that energy is lost as heat. That is why there is only 10% of the energy from the previous level that goes up to the next level. Now, this is my final slide. So I asked you in the learning objectives to be able to explain the difference between a biomass pyramid and an energy pyramid. So first of all, this slide also has pyramid of numbers, right? It's just showing you how many of each organism is at the trophic level. So like oak trees, you have a ton of them, you have fewer caterpillars, even less birds, and just one sparrowhawk. Biomass. So biomass is a term you probably haven't heard. It is the mass of living material in each organism multiplied by the total number of organisms in a level. So biomass is basically just like say you take a bunch of plants, put them in the oven, all the water is going to leave and you're left with just plant material. That is biomass. Okay, so it's also a pyramid. Whoop, hold on here. Pause my recording for dog barking. Sorry about that. Okay, so the biomass pyramid looks the same as the energy pyramid, and it's basically just showing you that for oak trees, I'm looking here on the right where it says biomass, you have to have a lot of plant material to support the number of caterpillars that you see here, and the number of like caterpillar tissue, right, or the mass of it is a lot less than the mass of the oak trees. By the way, mass is very similar to weight, right? It's just how much stuff weighs. The biomass of the bird that feeds on caterpillars is less than the biomass of the caterpillar. So this is just showing you the same concept, is that the energy at each level can only support certain number of organisms. So as you go up the trophic levels, fewer organisms are supported. Okay. So I want you to refer back to the learning objectives and get an idea of how all of these things fit together.